Eleanor Bishop, dressed in an elegant cream dress that emphasized her slim figure for her 51 years, stood next to her new husband, Ryan Collins, in a warm June evening that bathed the Oasis Country Club in soft golden light. His dark suit sat perfectly on his athletic figure, and his eyes showed an expression that could be interpreted as both happiness and triumph. The guests, gathered in a spacious room with panoramic windows overlooking the manicured garden and lake, were a select group of Boston society, Eleanor's business associates, family friends, and a few people from the Groom's side of the family. The contrast between these groups was obvious even to the uninitiated observer. "To a happy new family," said the host, raising a glass of champagne. "To Eleanor and Ryan." The guests echoed the toast, but a careful eye could notice some of them exchanging meaningful glances. The age difference between the young photographer and the wealthy owner of the restaurant chain was an obvious subject of whispers among the guests. In a corner of the room, away from the main group, stood Jessica Bishop, Eleanor's only daughter. A 26-year-old girl with brown hair pulled back into a tight bun, she held a glass of whiskey in her hand, which didn't seem to be the first of the evening. "I never thought I'd live to see the day my mother married a man only 3 years older than me," she murmured, turning to the man standing next to her. Michael Gardner, Ryan's best friend and business partner, only shrugged. "You know Ryan. He's always been able to find opportunities where others see only obstacles." "You mean finding rich women to sponsor his creative projects?" Jessica took another sip. Michael frowned and looked around. "Look, I don't want to ruin the party. Ryan's a talented photographer. He just needs some financial assistance at the moment." "Assistance?" Jessica grinned bitterly. "My mother bought him a new studio in downtown Boston before we got married, and now he has access to the fortune my father spent a lifetime building." Michael wanted to say something in response, but at that moment Eleanor approached them. Despite her smile, her eyes expressed concern. "Jessica, darling, perhaps you could say a few words after all. The guests are waiting." Jessica gave her mother a cold look. "What exactly do you want to hear, Mother? How happy I am that you married a man who could be your son? Or how happy I am that we're one big happy family now?" Eleanor sighed and lowered her voice. "Please, not today. We can discuss all your objections later, but right now I'm asking you to just be polite." "Okay." Jessica set the empty glass on the tray of a passing waiter. "I'll be polite, but don't ask me to pretend to approve of this marriage." She headed toward the makeshift stage where guests were already gathered to congratulate the newlyweds. Eleanor looked at her daughter and turned to Michael. "Do you think she will calm down?" Michael smiled crookedly. "Jessica is just protecting you, Mrs. I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins now. She's worried about you." "I know," Eleanor nodded. "But I'm old enough to make my own decisions, and I love Ryan." Michael glanced across the hall at his friend, who was at that moment talking to a group of older men, obviously Eleanor's business associates. "Of course you do," he said after a pause. "And Ryan loves you." There was a note in his voice that Eleanor couldn't quite interpret. Doubt? Worry? Jealousy? But she chose to ignore it. Today was her day, the day she was starting a new chapter of her life with a man who may have been considerably younger than her, but made her feel alive again after the death of her first husband. Across the room, Ryan Collins was skillfully keeping the conversation going with the bank owners who were old friends of Eleanor's first husband. "So, you say you specialize in portrait photography?" One of them, a gray-haired man with shrewd eyes, asked. "Not only that," Ryan replied with a charming smile. "I work in a variety of genres, from cityscapes to experimental photography. But it was portraits that first brought me recognition. Still, opening a studio downtown is quite an ambitious venture for a young photographer," said another banker, "especially in these times." "Eleanor believes in my talent," Ryan replied simply, "and I'm grateful for her support. Of course, I plan to make this studio profitable as soon as possible." "I'm sure you'll succeed," the first man said, but there was skepticism in his eyes. Eleanor always had a knack for picking out promising projects. Before Ryan could respond, Michael Gardner approached the group. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but can I steal the groom for just a minute? The photographer wants to get some shots while the natural light is still perfect." Ryan apologized and stepped aside with his friend. "Thanks for getting me out of there," he muttered. "Those old guys look at me like I'm a gold digger who's found his vein." "Isn't that so?" Michael asked quietly, looking straight into his friend's eyes. Ryan frowned. "We've had this discussion. I do have feelings for Eleanor. Yes, she helps me with the business, but that's not the main thing." "For God's sake, Ryan," Michael lowered his voice to a whisper. "You owe almost $100,000, and that's just to me. I'm not talking about your other creditors. Your studio is a money-eating black hole." "Things will change now," Ryan said confidently. "The new studio downtown will attract top-notch clients. Plus, now I have access to the right contacts. Have you seen those bankers? Their wives will be lining up to get portraits from Eleanor Bishop's son-in-law." Michael shook his head. "I hope you know what you're doing, because if you deceive Eleanor, her daughter will destroy you. I've seen the way she looks at you." "Jessica's just jealous," Ryan brushed it off. "She's used to being the only woman in her mother's life since her father died. And of course, she's afraid for the inheritance." "Does she have to?" Michael asked directly. Ryan didn't have time to answer because Eleanor walked up to them, smiling radiantly. "There you are, all ready for toasts and congratulations. Michael, you're going to say a few words as a friend of the groom too, right?" "I'd love to," Michael said with a strained smile. As the guests gathered for the toasts, Jessica was the first to take the stage. Her face was a flawless mask of politeness, but her eyes remained cold. "Dear friends and family," she began, "we are gathered today to celebrate the union of my mother, Eleanor Bishop, and Ryan Collins. Mom," she looked at Eleanor, "you've always taught me to follow my heart and not be afraid to make tough decisions. Today you showed that you follow that principle yourself." A light whisper ran through the room, the ambiguity of the phrase obvious. "Ryan," Jessica continued, turning her gaze to her new stepfather, "I hope you realize what an amazing woman you've married. My mother is strong, smart, and generous. Very generous." Ryan wrinkled his nose slightly, but kept a smile on his face. "I wish you both happiness," Jessica finished. "And I hope that your union brings what each of you is looking for." The applause sounded a little strained, but Eleanor nodded gratefully to her daughter. At least the speech wasn't overtly hostile. After a few standard congratulations from friends, Michael took the stage. He looked awkward, rubbing the cufflink on his sleeve. "I've known Ryan for 10 years, he began. "We met in college and have been close friends ever since. Ryan is a talented photographer and, without a doubt, a charismatic person. He has a knack for seeing beauty where others overlook it." Michael was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Eleanor, I haven't had the honor of knowing you long, but from what I can see, you are an amazing woman. Ryan was lucky to find you, very lucky." He raised his glass. "To Eleanor and Ryan, may your marriage be what you both want it to be." After the toasts and formal cake cutting, the guests dispersed to the club grounds. Eleanor went off to talk to old friends, and Ryan found himself at the bar, where Jessica unexpectedly joined him. "Impressive speech," he said, ordering a whiskey. "I especially like the part about your mother's generosity." "I was just stating a fact," Jessica shrugged. "My mom's really generous, especially to the people she loves." "If you're trying to tell me that I married your mother for money?" "Didn't you?" Jessica turned to him, looking straight into his eyes. "Let's be honest, Ryan. I did some checking. Your studio's on the verge of bankruptcy, you're in debt, and suddenly you're in love with a rich woman who's more than 20 years older than you?" Ryan remained calm. "You can believe what you want. But I love your mother. Yes, I have financial difficulties. What startup business doesn't? But it has nothing to do with my feelings for Eleanor. Do you know what the saddest part is?" Jessica shook her head. She really believes it. Believes that the handsome young photographer was genuinely in love with her and not her bank account. "Maybe you should give your mother more credit," Ryan replied. "She's not a naive girl. She's a successful businesswoman who built a chain of restaurants from scratch. Do you think she can't recognize sincerity?" Jessica finished her drink. "I hope you don't hurt her, because if you do, I'll do anything to make you regret it. That's it, Ryan." With those words, she walked away, leaving him at the bar. Ryan took a swig of whiskey and ordered another. His gaze involuntarily stopped on Eleanor, who was laughing, talking to her friends. His expression changed for a moment, something calculating and cold through the mask of a loving husband. but in a second he was smiling again, raising his glass toward his new wife. At the other end of the room, Michael Gardner watched the scene with growing concern. He pulled out his phone and quickly checked his account balance. The numbers were not encouraging. Ryan had promised to pay him back right after the wedding, but now Michael was beginning to doubt that would happen, especially after seeing the look Ryan gave his new wife when he thought no one could see him. The wedding festivities continued until late into the night. When most of the guests had departed, Eleanor and Ryan said goodbye to their remaining friends and family. They planned to go on their honeymoon at the Bishop's country home the next day. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Eleanor said as she hugged her daughter goodbye. "And for your speech. I know it's not easy for you to accept my decision." Jessica hugged her mother back. "I just want you to be happy, Mom. Just be careful." "I'm always careful," Eleanor smiled. "And I'm happy. I really am." Ryan walked over to them, putting his arm around Eleanor's waist. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Collins?" "More than ready," she replied, and they headed for the exit, where a chauffeured car was waiting. Jessica watched them with an expression that was a mixture of anxiety and determination. Michael stopped beside her. "You know, maybe we're wrong about him. Maybe he really does love your mother." Jessica shook her head. "I know people like Ryan. They take what they want without caring about the consequences to others. And I'm not going to let him break my mother's heart, or worse, ruin her." "What are you going to do?" Michael asked curiously. "Just watch," Jessica replied, "and gather information, and then we'll see." She turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Michael pensive. He checked his phone again. There was no message from Ryan. The money his friend had promised to return right after the wedding was still owed. It was starting to get light outside the club's windows. The new day brought not only the official start of Eleanor and Ryan's marriage, but also the first seeds of suspicion and conflict. The Bishop's country home, a 2-hour drive from Boston, was an impressive 3-story colonial-style building surrounded by a manicured garden with a tennis court and outdoor pool. This was where Eleanor had decided to spend her honeymoon with Ryan, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, but close enough to get back to business quickly if necessary. The morning of the 3rd day of their stay was particularly warm. Eleanor woke up before her husband and went down to the terrace with a cup of coffee. It still felt a little strange to call 29-year-old Ryan her husband, but she couldn't deny that she felt happy and young around him. "Good morning," came a voice behind her. Jessica came out onto the terrace, dressed in a tracksuit. "I didn't expect you to get up so early." "Habit," Eleanor smiled. "Even on vacation I can't sleep past 7. What are you doing here? I thought you were staying in town until the weekend." Jessica poured himself some coffee from the coffee pot. "I had to pick up some papers from the office, and I thought I might stay for a day or two if that's okay with you. After all, it's still my house too." Eleanor looked at her daughter carefully. "Of course I don't mind. But I hope you didn't come here to make a scene for Ryan. We agreed that we would give this marriage a chance, remember?" "I remember," Jessica nodded, sipping her coffee. "And I'm not going to make a scene. I'm just going to observe." "Watching what, exactly?" Eleanor sounded annoyed. "Your husband's honeymoon." Jessica nodded toward the pool. "Like the fact that he's been on the phone for half an hour instead of being with you." Eleanor turned and indeed saw Ryan by the pool with his phone in his hand. He was gesturing vigorously, clearly immersed in a serious conversation. "He has a job," Eleanor said in a defensive tone. "The new studio opens in 2 weeks, and he has a lot of things to deal with." "Of course," Jessica said skeptically, "especially now that he has an unlimited budget thanks to you." "Jessica," Eleanor sighed, "I've already told you that the money I put into Ryan's studio is an investment, not a gift. We have a contract, and he will repay those funds." "Do you really believe that?" Jessica smiled sadly. "Mom, I saw the financial statements of his previous studio. He's in debt like silk, and it's not just business risks. He hired expensive models, bought equipment he couldn't afford, rented space he couldn't afford." "I know about his financial problems," Eleanor said seriously. "He told me everything." "Everything?" Jessica asked doubtfully. "Including $100,000 in debt to Michael Gardner?" Eleanor froze for a moment. "What? Not everything?" Jessica shook her head. "I talked to Michael after the wedding. He didn't want to say anything, but he seemed concerned that Ryan wasn't returning his calls about the refund. "It's a misunderstanding," Eleanor set her cup aside. "I'll talk to Ryan." "Before you do," Jessica put her hand on her mother's shoulder, "I want you to know that I will support whatever decision you make. Even if I think this marriage is a mistake, I will always be on your side." Eleanor nodded gratefully, but she didn't have time to respond because Ryan came up onto the terrace. He looked tense, but a smile lit up his face at the sight of his wife. "Good morning, darling." He came up and kissed Eleanor on the cheek, then nodded to Jessica. "I didn't realize we had company. I came to pick up some papers," Jessica replied dryly. "I thought I'd stay for a while. I hope you don't mind." "Of course not." Ryan faked a smile. "It's your house, too." There was a subtle note of uncertainty in his voice that Eleanor chose to ignore. "I heard you had an important call," she said instead. "Is everything okay with the studio opening?" "Pretty much," Ryan nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "There were just some problems with the equipment suppliers, but I'll take care of it." "Maybe I can help?" Eleanor suggested. "I'm well connected in the business community." No, Ryan answered hastily. "You've done enough already. I want to handle these matters myself. This is my business, and I need to learn how to handle things on my own." Jessica raised an eyebrow slightly, but remained silent. "By the way," Ryan continued, turning to his wife, "do you mind if I go into town this afternoon? I need to meet with the vendors in person. I'll be back for dinner." "Sure," Eleanor nodded. "Take my car, it'll be faster." "Thanks," Ryan finished his coffee. "Then I'll go get ready." When he left, Jessica looked at her mother carefully. "Aren't you going to ask him about his debt to Michael?" "Not now," Eleanor shook her head. "Ryan's already under a lot of stress with the studio opening. We'll talk about it later." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Near noon, Ryan drove into town in Eleanor's silver Mercedes. Jessica, who watched his departure from the window of her second-floor office, dialed a number on her cell phone. "Michael, it's Jessica Bishop. Listen, I think you should know Ryan's on his way into town. Apparently he's meeting with some vendors. Yeah, sure. Keep me posted." She hung up and went back to her laptop. The financial records of Ryan's previous photography studio were open on the screen. The numbers weren't encouraging. The business wasn't just unprofitable, it was woefully inefficient. And the strangest part was that large sums of money were regularly withdrawn into personal accounts. Not Ryan's, but some third parties. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At the same time, Ryan met with Michael at a small cafe in downtown Boston. Michael looked nervous and was constantly looking around. "You promised to pay me back right after the wedding," he began without preamble. "It's been a week, Ryan." I know. Ryan held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "And I'll pay you back every dime. I just need a little more time." "Time?" Michael laughed nervously. "I don't have any time. The bank is threatening to foreclose on my house if I don't make the payment by the end of the month. That money was my life savings, Ryan." "Look," Ryan lowered his voice, leaning closer. "I've got it all figured out. The new studio will be profitable in a month. I've got pre-orders from some big clients." "You said the same thing about the last studio," Michael said skeptically. "Where is it now? Closed with $500,000 in debt." "It's different this time," Ryan insisted. "I have a reliable source of funding. Eleanor trusts me completely." "How long will it last?" Michael asked. "Her daughter is digging for you. She called me today, told me you were coming into town." Ryan tensed. "What exactly did she want?" "To find out if I was seeing you." Michael finished his coffee. "I told her I wasn't. But she's not stupid, Ryan. Sooner or later she'll find what she's looking for." "By then it won't matter," Ryan replied cryptically. "Look, I can give you $20,000 right now. Will that be enough for a down payment on the bank?" Michael looked at his friend in surprise. "Where did you get $20,000 all of a sudden?" "It doesn't matter." Ryan pulled an envelope out of his jacket pocket and handed it across the table. "Here's the check. I'll pay the rest back 2 weeks after the studio opens." Michael took the envelope with disbelief. "Are you sure this is legitimate money? What difference does it make to you?" Ryan grinned. "You want the money, I have it. End of story. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk." That evening, when Ryan hadn't returned, Eleanor decided to go to his temporary office on the first floor of the country house. He'd set it up as soon as he'd arrived, moving his laptop, a few files and his camera equipment into it. Eleanor hadn't planned to look for anything. She just wanted to leave a note on the desk inviting him to dinner. But as she placed the piece of paper on the table, her gaze fell involuntarily on an ajar folder of documents. They were bank statements, and the amounts on them made Eleanor freeze in place. We were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars transferred to various accounts over the past few months. And strangest of all, the source of most of those transfers wasn't Ryan, but one Alexander Stern, a name Eleanor had never heard before. She carefully turned a few more pages and found a copy of a passport in Alexander Stern's name. The picture showed Ryan, but with a different hairstyle and wearing glasses. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. What did this mean? Was her husband using a false identity for some kind of financial transaction? But why? And where did he get such sums of money? Her musings were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up. Eleanor hurriedly put the documents back and left the office, trying to keep a calm expression on her face. Jessica hardly spoke at all, only answering direct questions. Ryan was unusually animated and talked a lot about his plans for the new studio. Eleanor listened attentively, trying to catch any inconsistencies in his words or hints about his secret life, but she didn't notice anything suspicious. After dinner, Ryan excused himself, saying that he needed to work on some papers in his office. Eleanor and Jessica were left alone on the terrace. "You look worried," Jessica remarked, looking at her mother carefully. "Is something wrong?" "I found some strange documents in Ryan's office. Bank statements for large sums of money and a copy of a passport in a different name, with his picture on it." Jessica straightened up. "What name?" "Alexander Stern." Eleanor lowered her voice. "Do you know anything about that?" "No," Jessica shook her head. "But it explains the strange translations I found in his studio reports. Mom, this is serious. If he's using a false identity for financial transactions, it could be fraud or money laundering." "I can't believe it." Eleanor covered her eyes with her hand. "Why would he do that? I mean, he has me, my money, my support." "Maybe he needs more," Jessica said quietly. "Or maybe he was involved in these schemes before he met you and now he can't get out." "I have to talk to him," Eleanor said firmly. "Right now." "Wait," Jessica held her mother's hand. "Wouldn't it be better to gather more information first? If he really is involved in something illegal, a direct confrontation could be dangerous." The clock was almost midnight when Eleanor decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed the study, she noticed that the lights were still on, but Ryan wasn't inside. His laptop stood open on the desk. Eleanor hesitated only a moment and then entered the study. This was her chance to find out the truth. She approached the laptop, but the screen was already dimmed, going into standby mode. She pressed a key and the computer asked for a password. With a frustrated sigh, Eleanor looked around. On the desk were several folders of documents, the same ones she had seen during the day. She opened the top one and again saw bank statements in Alexander Stern's name. The amounts of the transfers made her heart clench. $200,000, $300,000, $500,000. Where would Ryan get that kind of money? Suddenly, some sound came from the garden, the splashing of water. Eleanor went to the window and saw Ryan by the pool. He was on the phone, gesticulating vigorously. Even from a distance, it was obvious that the conversation was tense. Eleanor hurriedly put her papers back in their place and left the office. She walked quietly across the terrace and approached the pool, trying to stay in the shadows. "It's out of the question." Ryan's voice sounded cold and determined, not at all like his usual manner of speaking. "We agreed on $500,000, not a cent less." There was a pause, during which he answered something. "I don't care about your problems," Ryan continued. "I have what you want. If you want the goods, you pay full price, and no delays." Another pause. "Tomorrow, at the usual place, and don't be late." Ryan ended the call and squeezed the phone in his hand with force, as if he wanted to break it. Then he took a deep breath, relaxed, and turned toward the house. Eleanor barely had time to retreat into the shadows as he walked past her toward the terrace. She froze, afraid to even breathe. until his footsteps faded into the house. What was that? What merchandise was Ryan talking about? And why was he demanding $500,000? Questions swarmed in Eleanor's mind as she moved cautiously toward the house. But before she could take a few steps, Jessica appeared from behind the bushes. "Mom?" she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "I saw Ryan," Eleanor answered quietly. "He was on the phone talking about some $500,000 product." Jessica's eyes widened. "Did you hear who he was talking to?" "No." Eleanor shook her head. "But he made an appointment for tomorrow." "We have to find out what he's involved in," Jessica said firmly. "If it's drugs or something else illegal, you could be an accomplice without even realizing it." "I can't believe it," Eleanor whispered. "He seemed so real." "Some people are very good actors." Jessica took her mother's hand. "Let's go inside. We need to talk about this." They were on their way to the terrace when they heard the splash of water behind them. Eleanor turned around and saw that Ryan had jumped into the pool and was swimming, paddling with powerful strokes. "It's a strange time to be swimming," Jessica said. "He often swims at night," Eleanor said. "He says it helps him relax." They went up to the terrace and retired to the house, not noticing that a figure had emerged from the darkness of the garden to the pool. The man stopped at the water's edge, watching Ryan swimming. Something glinted in the stranger's hand, a metal object that he clutched tightly. Ryan, having completed another swim, swam to the edge and climbed out of the water. He turned and froze when he saw the man standing in front of him. "What are you doing here?" he began, but didn't finish the sentence. A brief, muffled sound broke the silence of the night. Ryan swayed, grabbing his chest, then collapsed back into the pool. The water around him began to turn a dark color. The man stood for a few more seconds, watching the body slowly sink to the bottom, and then vanished into the shadows of the trees as imperceptibly as he had appeared. Silence returned to the garden. Only the moonlight reflected in the water of the pool where the body of Eleanor Bishop's young husband lay motionless. Eleanor's screams cut through the pre-dawn silence of the Bishop's country house. She had discovered Ryan's body floating in the pool at about 5 in the morning when she had gone down to the first floor to look for her husband, who had not returned to the bedroom. Jessica was the first to arrive at her screams, followed by the security guard on duty at the estate gate. An hour later, the area around the pool was fenced off with police tape, and forensic investigators were methodically examining every inch of the surrounding area. Eleanor sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket. Despite the warm morning, Jessica did not leave her mother's side, holding her hand and occasionally offering her water or tea. "Mrs. Collins," a middle-aged woman in a strict suit entered the living room. "I'm Detective Sarah Montgomery. I'm very sorry about what happened. May I ask you a few questions?" Eleanor lifted her tear-red eyes and nodded. "Yes, of course." Detective Montgomery sat down across from her, placing a notebook on her lap. "Tell me what happened last night. When was the last time you saw your husband alive?" "We had dinner together around 9 o'clock, Eleanor said quietly, as if she was struggling with every word. "Then Ryan said he had some paperwork to do in his office. I went up to the bedroom around 11, but he was still working." "And you didn't see him until morning?" the detective clarified. Eleanor cast a quick glance at Jessica, then shook her head. "No. I woke up around 5 and not finding him around, I went downstairs. First, I looked in the study, but he wasn't there. Then I went out on the terrace and—" Her voice trembled. "I saw him in the pool." The detective made a note in her notebook. "Did you notice anything unusual last night? Any strange noises? Strangers on the grounds?" "No, nothing like that." Eleanor wrung her hands nervously. "We have an excellent security system." "I know," Montgomery nodded. "I've already talked to security. The cameras didn't pick up any intruders. That means that either the killer knew the security system very well, or it was one of us," Jessica finished for her. "Is that what you're saying, Detective?" Montgomery looked at the young woman carefully. "I'm just considering all the possibilities, Miss Bishop. How long have you been in the house?" "I arrived yesterday morning." Jessica straightened up. "I wanted to pick up some papers from the study and decided to stay for a few days." "And how did you feel about your mother and Mr. Collins's marriage?" Jessica looked at Eleanor, then answered, I make no secret of the fact that I was against that marriage. Ryan was too young for my mother, and he had serious financial problems. I believed he married her for money, but I would never hurt my mother by killing her husband. No one is accusing you, Miss Bishop, the detective said calmly. It's just a conversation for now. May I ask where you were between midnight and 3 a.m.? In my room. Jessica tensed slightly. I was working on some papers I brought back from the city, and then I went to bed. Can anyone confirm that? No, I was alone. Jessica held the detective's gaze. But if you think I killed Ryan, you'll have to explain how I was able to shoot him without a gun. Shoot him? The detective raised an eyebrow. I didn't say Mr. Collins was shot. We haven't announced the cause of death yet. Jessica turned pale. I was just speculating. I mean, it was probably murder, right? Right, Montgomery nodded. And Mr. Collins was indeed shot. One shot to the heart. But I wonder how you came to that conclusion. Mom mentioned it when she called the police, Jessica answered quickly. Didn't she, Mom? Eleanor looked confused. I don't remember. It's all a blur. Detective Montgomery made another note and stood up. Thank you for your cooperation. I need to talk to the staff and security, and I'll ask you not to leave the estate for the next few days. We will return to this conversation again. Asterisk. 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 Detective Montgomery sat in her temporary headquarters set up in the guest house of the estate. On the desk in front of her were files with the first forensic results and crime scene photos. What have we got? She asked her assistant, a young officer named Parker. Time of death between midnight and 2 a.m., he began, checking the records. Cause of death was a gunshot wound to the heart. Weapon was a small caliber pistol, believed to be a .22. Bullet lodged in the body. Ballistics will be ready tomorrow. No witnesses, no cameras, Montgomery said thoughtfully. What do we know about the victim? Ryan Collins, 29, photographer, married Eleanor Bishop a week ago, has financial problems. His previous studio went bankrupt with debts of about $500,000. No criminal record, no apparent enemies. Everybody has enemies. Montgomery leaned back in her chair, especially those with debts of $500,000. Who are his major creditors? Working on it, Parker nodded. But there's something interesting. We checked the victim's phone. The last call was made at 23:45 to a number registered to one Michael Gardner. Judging by the length of the call, it was almost 10 minutes long. Michael Gardner, Montgomery made a note. Find out everything you can about him and bring him in for questioning. What else? We found something strange in the victim's office. Parker handed her a file folder. Looks like a fake passport in the name of Alexander Stern with Collins's picture on it, and bank statements for large sums of money. Montgomery looked through the documents quickly. Interesting. Looks like our photographer was leading a double life. Run this Stern guy through all the databases. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Michael Gardner arrived at the Bishop estate towards evening. He looked nervous and exhausted as a police officer escorted him to the guest house, where Detective Montgomery was conducting interviews. Mr. Gardner, thank you for coming. Montgomery indicated a chair for him. I'm Detective Sarah Montgomery. I have a few questions about the murder of Ryan Collins. Yeah, I can't believe he's dead. Michael shook his head. Who could have done this? I hope you can help me find out. Montgomery watched his reaction carefully. You were the last person Ryan spoke to on the phone before he died. What was that conversation about? Michael became even more nervous. We were discussing his new studio. He was planning to open in a couple weeks and was very excited. At midnight? The detective clarified skeptically. Ryan was always a midnight guy, Michael shrugged, especially when he was excited about something. Mr. Gardner, Montgomery leaned forward, we know that Ryan Collins owed you a large sum of money, $100,000 to be exact. Is that correct? Michael shuddered. Yes, that's true, but he started paying it back. Yesterday he gave me a check for $20,000. Where did he get that kind of money all of a sudden? I don't know. Michael looked away. I didn't ask. Ryan always knew how to find money when he needed it. Do you know the name Alexander Stern? Michael froze for a moment, then shook his head slowly. No, I've never heard of it. That's strange. Montgomery pulled a photograph out of the folder. Because last week you transferred $50,000 into Alexander Stern's account. The same $50,000 that Ryan returned to you as part of his debt. Why? Michael turned pale. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Montgomery placed the bank statement in front of him. Ryan Collins was doing some illegal activity under the name Alexander Stern, and you were aware of it. What's more, you were involved in his schemes. No, it's not like that. Michael rubbed his forehead nervously. Look, I didn't kill Ryan. Yes, I knew about Alexander Stern. Ryan was using that name for certain deals. What kind of deals? The detective persisted. Michael took a deep breath. Art. Ryan was in the business of reselling art, sometimes, not entirely legally. You mean he dealt in stolen art? Not stolen art, Michael said hastily. More like of dubious provenance, or fakes. He was a brilliant photographer and could make such high-quality copies of paintings that even experts could not always distinguish them from the originals. Montgomery thoughtfully tapped her pen on the table. And how long has he been doing this? About 3 years, Michael admitted. At first it was a one-time deal, but then he got into it. The money was too good. What about his marriage to Eleanor Bishop? Was that part of the scheme too? Michael lowered his eyes. I don't know. At first I thought it was. But lately it seemed to me that he was really starting to have feelings for her. He started talking about getting out of the illegal business, starting fresh. And when was he going to do that? Montgomery asked. After the last deal. Michael looked up at her. He had a meeting scheduled for today. A big deal, selling a forgery of a famous painting for $500,000. He said that after that, he would have enough money to pay off all his debts and start an honest business. Asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk. The next morning, Detective Montgomery gathered everyone in the living room of the Bishop mansion. Eleanor sat on the couch next to Jessica. Michael Gardner was shuffling nervously from foot to foot by the fireplace. The Bishop family lawyer, summoned by Eleanor after the first interrogation, sat in a chair by the window. Thank you all for your presence, Montgomery began. Over the last 24 hours, we've gathered a significant amount of information about the murder of Ryan Collins, and I think it's time to summarize. She paused, looking around at those present. Ryan Collins wasn't just a photographer with financial problems. He led a double life under the name of Alexander Stern and was in the business of making and selling fake works of art. This activity brought him a significant income. We found more than $1 million in Stern's accounts. Eleanor gasped quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. We also established that on the night of the murder, Ryan was to meet with a client for a major transaction, the sale of a fake painting for $500,000. It was to be his last illegal operation. His last? Eleanor interjected. Why? Because according to Mr. Gardner, your husband decided to quit the illegal business and start an honest life, the detective replied, perhaps because of his feelings for you. Eleanor cast a grateful glance at Michael, who smiled weakly in return. But not everyone was happy about the decision, Montgomery continued, especially those who depended on his talent. And last night we received the ballistics results that allowed us to identify the weapon that killed Ryan Collins. She turned to Michael. It's a .22 caliber pistol registered in your name, Mr. Gardner. Michael turned pale. What? That's impossible. My gun is kept at home in a safe. Not anymore. The detective shook her head. We checked. The safe was open, the gun was missing, and according to your girlfriend's statement, you were out of the house between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m., which contradicts what you said. I didn't kill Ryan! Michael exclaimed. Yes, we argued on the phone about money and his plans to go out of business, but I would never hurt him. Unfortunately, the evidence says otherwise. Montgomery nodded to the police officers standing by the door. Michael Gardner, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Ryan Collins. As Michael was being led out of the room, Jessica suddenly stood up. Wait, he didn't kill Ryan. Everyone turned to her. I did, Jessica said firmly. Jessica, no, Eleanor exclaimed. Mom, I have to tell the truth. Jessica looked determined. I couldn't let that crook trick you and take all your money. Montgomery gestured to the police officers. Miss Bishop, do you realize you're confessing to murder? Yes, Jessica nodded. I found out about his schemes and decided to put a stop to it. I stole Michael's gun when I met him in town, and I shot Ryan when he was swimming in the pool. That's an interesting confession, the detective said thoughtfully, especially considering that Ryan wasn't killed in the pool. He was shot on the shore before he fell into the water, and he was shot in the chest, not in the back, as he would have been if he'd been swimming. Jessica blinked confusedly. I meant when he came out of the pool. No, Miss Bishop. Montgomery shook her head. You're just trying to protect your mother, aren't you? Because you know she killed Ryan. There was silence in the room. Eleanor slowly rose from the couch. It's true, Detective, I killed my husband. Mom, no! Jessica exclaimed. It's all right, dear, Eleanor said softly. I can't let you take the blame for me. She turned to the detective. I found out about his double life, about the passport in the name of Alexander Stern, about the forged paintings, about the machinations. And that night I overheard him talking on the phone about his latest deal. He was going to take the money and disappear. Everything he said about loving me was a lie. So you decided to kill him? Montgomery asked. I wanted to talk to him. Eleanor's voice trembled. Give him a chance to explain. But when I saw him by the pool, so smug, planning how he was going to run off with my money, I couldn't take it. I went to the office where he'd left the gun. I'd seen it in his desk drawer before. And then I fired. Montgomery listened intently, then shook her head. That's a very touching confession, Mrs. Collins, but it doesn't fit the facts. Ryan was killed with a gun by Michael Gardner, who was never in your house. And according to the coroner's report, the shooter was considerably taller than the victim, which rules you out. Eleanor looked at the detective confused. I don't understand. None of you three killed Ryan Collins, Montgomery said. And I think the real killer is listening to our conversation right now. She turned to the door where the manor guard was standing. Are you Mr. Torres? The guard flinched. What? You worked for the Bishop family for over a decade, the detective continued. And you were very loyal to the late Mr. Bishop. So devoted, in fact, that you couldn't let some crook defraud his widow and take the family fortune. Everyone turned to the guard, who stood, unmoving, stone-faced. We found your prints on the gun, Mr. Torres, Montgomery said calmly. And the security footage shows you leaving your post at midnight and returning 30 minutes later, right around the time Ryan Collins was killed. That's impossible, the guard said hoarsely. I never left my post. You're right, the detective nodded. The main cameras show that you stayed at your post, but my men found a hidden camera installed by the late Mr. Bishop to monitor the entrance to the property, and it clearly shows you walking towards the house at around midnight. The guard's face twitched, but he remained silent. Eleanor, Montgomery turned to the lady of the house. Have you noticed anything strange about Mr. Torres's behavior lately, especially since your wedding to Ryan? Eleanor hesitated. He's been more tense than usual, and I've seen him watching Ryan a few times, but I thought he was just doing his security duties. He was doing his duties, the detective agreed, but not the ones you're thinking of. Mr. Torres felt it was his duty to protect you from Ryan, especially after he found out about his double life. Is that true? Eleanor turned to the guard who had been part of their family for years. Torres was silent for a few seconds, then nodded slowly. Your husband promised me, he said quietly, looking Eleanor straight in the eyes. Before he died, George Bishop made me promise that I would protect you from anyone who tried to hurt you. And this man, this Ryan, he planned to rob you and disappear. I heard him on the phone. So you were following him? Montgomery asked. Yes, Torres admitted. I didn't trust him from the start. Too young, too smooth. And when Miss Jessica started investigating his past, I started gathering information too. I found out about his double life, his fake passports, his art scams. And you decided to kill him? I decided to protect the Bishop family, Torres said firmly. That night I overheard him talking to someone on the phone. He was talking about his last deal and how he was going to disappear. I knew he would break Mrs. Bishop's heart and possibly bankrupt her. I couldn't let that happen. But how did you get Michael's gun? Jessica asked. He left it in the car when he came to the wedding, Torres answered. I found it when I was checking the guests' cars and I kept it, just in case. I knew it might come in handy sooner or later. Montgomery nodded to the police officers and they approached the guard. Javier Torres, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Ryan Collins. As the officers handcuffed him, Torres looked at Eleanor. I don't regret what I did, Mrs. Bishop. I kept my promise to your husband. I protected you. There was silence in the room as the guard was led away. Finally, Eleanor turned to the detective. What happens now? Mr. Torres will be charged with murder, Montgomery replied. But given the circumstances and his impeccable reputation, the court will probably take mitigating factors into account. What about Ryan's money? Jessica asked. What about the money he made from his fraud? Alexander Stern's accounts are frozen, the detective said. There will be an investigation. If the money was obtained illegally, it will be confiscated. If not, well, you, Mrs. Collins, as the legal widow, are entitled to it. Eleanor grinned bitterly. I don't want that money. Let it be given to the people he cheated if there are any. Detective Montgomery nodded. That's honorable of you. Now, if you don't mind, I need to finish the formalities. We're closing this case.